Welcome back, everyone. So we are now entering the second part of this session, which has to do with uh, various aspects of development economics. And in this part, we are going to have Dr. Paul Novosad, and we're going to have a presentation from him. Before we start off, I would like to introduce him a little bit. So Paul is an associate professor of economics at Dartmouth College. His research examines why poor countries have remained poor for so long and what policy interventions can help improve people's lives in developing countries. So his team builds new open source economic data from information age sources like satellites and private and government sector data. And some of his recent projects include judicial bias in India, impacts of India's large-scale rural roads program, intergenerational mobility in developing countries, and so on and so forth. Paul is the founder of Development Data Lab, and I am hoping that he's going to speak a little bit about this as well. And he's a creator of the Shrug. Shrug is an acronym, of course. It's socioeconomic data. I'm forgetting the full name of this, but this is something that he does along with Sam Asher and Toby Lund. So this is something that is turning into a very popular data platform for socioeconomic research in India. And of course, in other countries. So with those words, I'm going to invite Paul to, so you can begin your presentation. Would you like to share your slides?
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here as well. So you can see my slides?
Yes, this is funny.
Good. So this is the title page from one paper which I'll be talking about the most, and this is joint work with Sam Asher, who's my longtime collaborator on all the India work that we've been doing. And this line of work on mobility is joint with Charlie Rafkin at MIT. I'm going to mention a couple other projects over the course of the talk, and I will try to remember to list the many people who've helped us on these projects as well. So the broad goal of this paper is we started this project wanting to understand intergenerational mobility in India across subgroups, across space, across time. And this is a measure of equality of opportunity. I'll talk in more detail about exactly what specific thing we are measuring as I go. So just to outline where I'm going to go, and hopefully I have enough time to cover all of these, I'm going to talk a little bit about the measurement of intergenerational educational mobility, our object of interest in this paper. I'll talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing mobilizing administrative data for better policy research on development. I'm going to show you our results on intergenerational mobility in India, and then a little bit of preliminary analysis on thinking of the mechanisms that drive some of the persistent disparities in upward mobility in India. So for this audience, I can skip the context very quickly. We all know that the last 3 or 4 decades in India have been an economic miracle in terms of number of people brought out of poverty and just kind of average living standards across the country. There are 2 stories that are widely told parallel to this trend of rising economic outcomes. One is that there's an increase in equality of opportunity, that old systems that hold people back are being left behind. So we read about Dalit millionaires, we hear about scaling caste walls with capitalism's ladders. And yet we also hear about how some of the old systems that entrench inequality are still in place. And so we wanted to, this is what we were thinking about in terms of our paper. What we wanted to understand is it, to what extent is it easier or harder to get ahead in relative terms in post-liberalization India? Everybody knows that on average, people are better off. So if I just look at your living standards and say, are you better off in consumption terms than your parents' generation? For the majority of families across all social groups, that's going to be true. But what about your ability to move up in the socioeconomic hierarchy? Now, we know that India's caste system is a system that has made it very difficult to move up in the social hierarchy. In fact, there are strong social norms against moving up in the social hierarchy. So we can think of this as an anti-intergenerational mobility system. Like the whole premise of this system is the tier of society in which you were born into should determine the tier into society that you spend your entire life and your children's life. And so we are interested in understanding the extent to which this has changed in this period of economic transformation and urbanization, and a very significant anti-discrimination policy agenda. Since India's independence, there have been many policies and programs targeted at lower caste groups in particular to try to close the gaps and put an end to this lack of upward mobility. So it's really important to clarify. In this paper, we're talking about the ability to get ahead in relative rank terms. So I'm interested, for instance, if you are born to a family at the 25th percentile, we'll be talking about that a lot. Think that's like the midpoint of the bottom half of the distribution. What percentile do we expect you to get to? It's not irrespective of your consumption, because your living standards will depend on your percentile, but I'm particularly interested in whether you can move up or down in relative terms. If you're born at the bottom, are you stuck at the bottom? And this is not a question of growth or poverty or inequality. It's related to all of these terms, but we are strictly interested in this paper in this idea of relative status. And so some people say, oh, all we care about is utility. Maybe we should only care about living standards. And it doesn't matter if you're consigned to stay at the bottom of the distribution, if we can give you a good, comfortable life at the bottom of the distribution. So I'm sympathetic to that point. We absolutely should seek to shift the level of consumption of everyone in society to make it better off. But I also think that there is a strong case to be made for increasing equality of opportunity. I think there's a sense in which, regardless of how comfortable your life is, if you know with certainty that you and your children will always be at the bottom of a social hierarchy, that has big impacts on life satisfaction, and it has a big impact on how you see yourself as a citizen of your society. So I think irrespective of how much we can alleviate the suffering of poverty, I think there's high value in being interested in creating a system where people perceive that they have the opportunity to move up to the middle class, or to have a chance to be a millionaire, just like people born from any other class. This is a graph from Raj Chetty and co-authors' seminal 2014 paper on intergenerational mobility, on upward mobility. And I'm going to take a bit of time on this graph because this expresses the whole concept that we are trying to get at. So on the x-axis of this graph, I have, let me just find a marker here. Perfect. Okay. On the x-axis of this graph, I have parents ranked from 0 to 100. Think of this as parents in one cohort. So let's take all the children born in 1980 and let's rank them by their parents' income. This graph is showing you the average child income rank conditional on being born to a parent at a certain level. So I'm going to be talking a bunch about the 25th percentile, as I mentioned. So we can draw a line up here at the 25th percentile. And this tells you the gray dots are the United States. This tells you that a child born to the 25th percentile in the United States, on average, achieves the 42nd percentile. So we expect some mean reversion. This value is always going to be between 25 and 50. You can see that a child born at the same relative position in Denmark is going to be 5 percentage points higher, 47 at the 47th percentile. So Denmark is one of the highest mobility countries in the world. The United States, among developed countries, is considered a lower country. And so we're interested in measuring this type of relationship in India. So there's many ways you can measure mobility. You can look at the slope of these curves. The gray points have a high slope that indicates persistence of income across generations. So that's low mobility, low equality of opportunity. And we're going to be particularly interested in, this is just one statistic that we can use to summarize this whole distribution, to say, if you start at the 25th percentile, where do you end up? And so there's a bunch of technical work we do in this paper that goes into thinking about how do we calculate this thing at all. And I'll go into that a little bit. And what we find is, I'll just preview, in India, your average is around here, around the 37th or 38th percentile. I'll probably do that a little bit too high. So India, in terms of upward mobility, just the ability to move up in relative status terms, and this is modern post-liberalization India, actually it doesn't change very much over time, is about as far behind the United States in upward mobility as the United States is behind Denmark. Turn off my marker here. Okay, so here is that same non-parametric graph calculated in India. These graphs from Chetty and co-authors are based on using administrative tax data where you know the income level of nearly every person in society. We don't have that kind of data in India, particularly not being able to link it to parents and children. So when we look at upward mobility in many, pretty much everybody outside of the Nordic countries and the United States and maybe some other high-income countries, we're using much sparser data. So we're particularly interested in this paper at looking at education data. So here I've ranked fathers in the 1960s generation by education. And so this largest bin is fathers with less than 2 years of education. So this is the largest bin. If you take a look at the fathers of the 1960s generation, 58% of them had less than 2 years of education. The average education rank for sons in that group was about 39. And as one would expect, as you move up in the parental education distribution, the expected education outcome of children goes up as well. And so now I'm plotting the same data for the 1980s, and we can try to think about how this distribution has changed. And so if you just take a look at if you can imagine the curve connecting these points, I'll draw a curve through the black points here as best as I can. You can sort of see that the curve that I would draw through the black points pretty much seems to go through the brown points as well. And so we're kind of interested in finding a way to estimate this relationship. It's challenging to estimate because you can see this bottom point in the 1980s is lower on the graph than this point in the 1960s. And the reason it's lower is because being a father with less than 2 years of education, your son now has a lower rank, but you also have a lower rank because you're much more negatively selected. So this is sort of the technical challenge of this paper, where we are trying to say, how do you compare the mobility distribution over time when the bin boundaries are changing, right? In the 1960s, 58% of parents have less than 2 years of education. In the 1980s, only 38% of parents have less than 2 years of education. And so the way we're going to think about this is we're going to think about the conditional expectation function. That line that I drew through those points is one possible example of the conditional expectation function of child rank given parent rank. And because we don't observe the relative status of the large number of parents with less than 2 years of education, right? These parents are not all starting in equal situations. If you take all of the kind of illiterate zero education parents, some of them have much higher relative economic status than others. It's just something that we don't observe in the data. And so we can think there are multiple conditional expectation functions that can fit these data. And so what we do in this paper is we develop a methodology that you could think of it as drawing every single possible function that could fit the data and then putting the bounds on that function. And you can get a system that you get bounds that look something like this. So we have fairly high precision in understanding what the mobility relationship looks like in the top half of the data. And in the 1960s, we have a lot less certainty because this bin is so coarse. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to non-parametrically bound the shape of all the monotonic functions that fit the data. That's what we've done here, and there are more details in the paper. We're trying to do this with a really minimal set of assumptions to develop some results that are like robust to thinking about this in different ways. And then we're going to propose a measure of mobility, which we call bottom half mobility. This is the expected education rank of a child, that's on the y-axis, given a parent in the bottom half. So let me find my pen again. So we basically want to calculate some average outcome below this point. This point is intended to be at the bottom half. And what we'll find is that with relatively high precision, we can say, given the high bounds around this graph, we can say the average value of this function between 0 and 50 can be pretty tightly bounded. So this is a short talk where I'm trying to cover a lot of material. So I would just refer you to the paper, and we have some stylized examples of exactly how we calculate these bounds in the appendix. Actually, I think they're now in the body of the paper, which hopefully will make this more clear. For now, I'll just ask you to trust that we're generating a reasonably accurate and tied to the data statistic of bottom half mobility, which is basically the ability to move up from the bottom half. Oops. Okay. A lot of the data, actually most of the mobility data that we're using here is from the India Human Development Survey, but a lot of the ancillary data that we use in this paper and in most of our papers is from the Shrug, which is this data platform that we've been building up over the last 10 years. So our research team is really focused on mobilizing new 21st century sources of data to understand development. Historically, most policy and research in India has been based on these long form surveys that, like the NSS or the IHDS, that visit 50,000 households. And you get a ton of information about people, but they're fairly sparse. You're visiting sometimes, I guess that's, you're visiting, sometimes 100 households per district and trying to infer what's going on. Actually, we can show that the vast majority of variation in living standards is within district, not across district. Meanwhile, government and private sector, and now from satellites, we can get extremely precise, extremely detailed data at the village level, at the individual level. And so what the Shrug is a project that is basically trying to mobilize this kind of data and use it for development research. And there's kind of a big fixed cost to doing that, because government collects, you can think of like something like, say, Narega, where government interacts with hundreds of millions of people, generates a ton of data, but that data is mainly used for program implementation and just sits on servers. It takes a fairly high intensity bit of work to take that data and turn it into some kind of anonymized linkable form that's usable for development research. But once you've done that, what's neat about using administrative data is you get detailed descriptions of every grid cell or every village in India. And then any new administrative data set that you layer on top of that has a perfect match. In contrast, if you take multiple rounds of the NSS, you can't match individuals. You can't even match villages to see how people are doing. So this is something that we've been doing. We're trying to put as much data open, make as much data open to the public as possible. And we're especially keen for others working with administrative data to link their data to the Shrug and allow it to be, usable and create kind of multiplicative benefits. Each new data set that gets added can be linked to, dozens of other data sets. So we are currently in the middle of, lost control here, of working on our second major release of the Shrug. We're really excited about this. We think it's going to be coming out in, hopefully the next 6 months or so. In addition to having thousands of additional fields from core Indian data sets, we've been doing a lot of work on agricultural data lately and have identified a bunch of village level agricultural surveys like the Minor Irrigation Survey and the Cost of Cultivation Survey, which can be linked at the village level to tens or hundreds of thousands of villages. Those are all going to be in the next round of the Shrug. Something we're really excited about in the next round of the Shrug is we aim to have seamless integration with every geographic identifier used in India. So right now the Shrug is a village level data set. If you want to do work at the sub-district level, it's slightly complicated to link to some other data set. Or maybe you have a block level data set and blocks have slightly different boundaries from sub-districts, and it's really hard to link these across. So we've basically been developing algorithms that rapidly and efficiently transform data to all the different geographic levels of India, such that if you are bringing a data set, let's say that you're working with one of the ministries of health and you have data from health insurance at the block level, you can kind of immediately link it at whatever level you're working at, as long as it's one of the 20 most common geographic identifiers used by Indian government agencies. You kind of immediately link it to all the rest of the shrug and immediately transform it to any other level of geography that you want. And we're working on making this directly accessible in R, Stata, and Python. So you can be in R or Stata, you can just type a command, use shrug or get field from shrug or something like this, and it will immediately bring in whatever fields you want at whatever geography you want. And so we think this is going to be really exciting for education as well, to kind of put detailed data across a range of domains directly at the fingertips of students. So they can just start messing with the data immediately in classrooms. So the kind of key criteria for us to be able to do this, and this is one of the things that's very exciting in India, is that there's a lot of open government data. Government agencies through the National Informatics Center are putting their data online and allowing people to download and have access to that data. I think this is something that is always a little bit fragile in India, and we're always worried that some of these doors will close and that this data, which can be really valuable for understanding development, will be put behind closed doors, maybe because people don't want to be embarrassed by what the data reveals. And so if you're kind of interested in this idea of open government data and the costs and benefits, you can see our paper, which we presented at the Indian Policy Forum earlier this year, called Big Open Data for Development, a Vision for India. If you just search for the India Policy Forum papers, they're all posted up there. And this is a paper where we basically make the case that there are huge returns to having a more open data ecosystem around government data. And we're trying to lower the costs of making that happen through Shrug 2.0 as well. Okay, so on to the results from our mobility paper. Okay, so what I'm showing you, every graph that I'm going to show you now is going to be some variation. Most of them are going to be exactly this measure of bottom half mobility. So I'm showing you the average. I no longer have parental rank on the x-axis. I'm now just looking at how mobility changes over time. But each of these sets of bounds is generated from that non-parametric rank graph I showed you earlier. So if we look at the 1950s birth cohort, we can see that we can identify that this is sons born to fathers in the bottom half. In other words, born somewhere in the bottom 50%, have on average reached an outcome of somewhere between 35 and 38th percentile. You can see again that in Denmark, they would reach the 46th. In the United States, they would reach the 42nd. So you can think of total equality of opportunity. You'd expect these guys to reach the 50th percentile. Like, it doesn't matter where you are born, where you end up depends strictly on your ability and how hard you work. And so someone is just as likely to be rich growing up from the upper classes from the bottom class. That would be the 50th percentile. And if you have no mobility at all, if everyone stays at exactly the same outcome rank of their parents, then you would be at the 25th percentile. And so you can see again that India is about as far behind the United States as Denmark is ahead of the United States. What I find most striking about this graph is it's really flat over time, right? The 1950s birth cohort, these guys get educated in like the late 1950s, early 1960s, well before the liberalization era. And our youngest birth cohort here is roughly 1990 to 1992. So these kids are getting educated around the 2000 to 2010 era. There is no change in the post-liberalization era, at least as far as we can measure. Mobility is always measured with a little bit of a lag because you have to wait until people finish their education. So you can kind of only see today in 2021, if I had the most updated data, the last birth cohort I could look at would be those born in the 2000s. But you can see over this period, you can think of liberalization happening toward the second half of this period. There's no increase in average upward mobility. So this says that consumption shift that I showed you at the beginning, where you saw everyone's consumption moving up a lot, these data suggest that this is kind of a level shift. There's not a lot of increase in churn. Everyone's better off, but your relative status and your ability to increase relative status has not changed very much. when we split this by subgroup, you can see that there are large differences between Muslims who've had declining mobility for the last 25 years and scheduled castes who've had rising mobility. And our ability to measure upward mobility in the early years is a little bit noisy, which is why these bounds are higher, but there's basically little evidence that upper castes and OBCs, which we have to pool just because of the types of data that we have available, are experiencing any decline in mobility. So it's mostly flat on average, but there's this almost one-to-one divergence between Muslims and SCs, where all the gains of SCs are being balanced out by losses among Muslims. That graph was showing you sons. This is what we find for daughters. Daughters on average have slightly lower mobility than sons. But what's interesting is you don't see the Muslim SC divergence for daughters in the same way that you do for sons. That's something that we are continuing to investigate. The geography of upward mobility is extremely heterogeneous. This is our mobility map. You can see even in the low mobility states like Bihar that cities are islands of upward mobility. All these kind of light green dots are indicative of cities with high mobility in the context of rural areas with low mobility. And of course, the South really stands out as a place with high upward mobility. But even at the urban level, you can go neighborhood by neighborhood and find pockets of high and pockets of low upward mobility. And this motivates some of the new research that we're doing, trying to think about how neighborhoods directly affect economic opportunity. There's also, some interesting gender gaps in the data that we've only begun to explore. One of the things that you find is in urban areas, daughters actually have quite a bit higher mobility than boys, but in rural areas, they're much further behind. So it's kind of really interesting gender dynamics that have variation across space that I think are really important to study. And I'm running out of time. I think, Amlan, I'm trying to tie this off at just in 3 or 4 minutes to leave room to questions. Is that right?
Yeah. That's fine. You can take a few minutes.
Okay, so I'm gonna kind of skip some slides here and show you some highlights. We thought a lot about what are some mechanisms, and people have come to us a lot with mechanisms for like, oh, here's why I think that you see this Muslim scheduled caste mobility gap emerging. And I'm not going to show you the details, but we can rule out geography. It's not about where they live in a broad sense. You can find these same gaps opening up at the district level as you do at the national level. It's not about differential returns to education and occupational structure. People say, oh, Muslims are starting small businesses, they don't need education. Actually, returns to education for Muslims are just as high as they are for SCs, and you find exactly the same dynamics when you look at non-entrepreneurial families. So the occupational choice isn't explaining what we're seeing here. Fertility can't explain what's going on in this mobility gap. It's really, it kind of doesn't come close. And finally, I'll show you the evidence that we have on affirmative action. This is suggestive evidence, but we think it's interesting. We're taking another look at this paper by Yam Kassan in 2019, who found that groups that were, actually we're using Kassan's instrument to think about the role of affirmative action, whereby in the, now getting the year, I think it's in 1976, there's a national harmonization of which groups get assigned scheduled caste and which groups don't. And what you do is these Black groups are groups who were not SCs until the 1970s birth cohort, and then they gain SC status. And what you can see is these groups that gain status lately close the mobility gap between the red groups, which gained SC status quite early on. So this is fairly coarse data. We can just look at this kind of one cohort change across these relatively small subgroups over time. But these late SC groups have very low mobility until they obtain the SC classification. And then we see their mobility, fairly quickly start to close the gap between those who had the SC classification early on. It's really hard to know which particular policy this was because having SC status is, a wide range of policy preferences for SCs, from reservations in schools, from reservations in politics, to being targeted by various government programs, to programs being targeted at the village and district level based on SC shares and so on. So it's really hard to say what it is, but something in that whole set of packages seems to be doing something to help close the mobility gap for SCs. Of course, we can't do this analysis for Muslims, but this is just to show you that the package of affirmative action policies targeting scheduled castes over the long run does seem to have a fairly substantial effect on upward mobility. Let me see the time. Okay, very, very briefly, I'm gonna just preview some new work, which we're hopefully just a few weeks away from releasing a working paper on segregation and neighborhood public good access. The core idea of this work is looking at the neighborhood level at access to public services, where we have data that allows us to study 1.2 million neighborhoods across India. These are really small neighborhoods, 200 to 500. This says, yeah, it is people, it's not households. So we're talking about a small village, and in cities, we're talking about going city block by city block. And we're trying to identify patterns of residential segregation across income and social groups and see how those relate to access to public goods. And so I'll just jump to our kind of core result. These are showing you coefficient estimates of the relationship between the Muslim and SC share of your city block and whether you have access to a primary school, a secondary school, or a health center. Interestingly, in primary schools, we actually see SC-focused blocks are more likely to have primary schools. We think this is directly related to policies aiming to close the education gap and build primary schools in places where scheduled castes live. You can see Muslims are slightly disadvantaged by this measure. And then when you look at secondary schools and health centers, being in a SC concentrated urban neighborhood or being in a Muslim concentrated urban neighborhood has really substantial effects on the likelihood that you have a secondary school or health center in your neighborhood. So we can't prove that this is related to mobility, but we can prove that there are these really substantial neighborhood level disparities across groups. And what's interesting about looking at the neighborhood level is some of these differences don't even appear at the district level. And so if you have district-oriented policy, whereby you could target secondary schools to districts with a lot of SCs, in fact, we find that in some cases that happens, but the secondary schools don't end up in SC neighborhoods. The secondary schools end up in middle and upper caste neighborhoods in SC districts. And so this just highlights the advantage of using administrative data, which allows you to look beneath the district level at where public goods are going and how people are doing. So let me quickly conclude and say our research finds that this period of vast economic transformation and economic growth has not been inextricably linked to gains in intergenerational mobility. Somewhat surprisingly, and I would say depressingly, intergenerational mobility has not improved. I think of this as a real priority for the Indian state to create paths to upward mobility for people growing up in the lower caste, in the lower classes specifically. We do find that scheduled caste mobility is rising, suggesting that there are policy levers that you can pull that create opportunity for subgroups. Alas, all of this rise is being counterbalanced by a decline in upward mobility among a different marginalized group and roughly equal-sized marginalized group. Here's evidence that affirmative action explains a bunch of this gap, and nascent work suggests that neighborhood public service inequality could be a major channel for these changes. So I rushed through that a lot. That's three different papers that I tried to summarize, but hopefully gave you a flavor. And all of these things are papers that you can look up on my website and read more about if you're interested.
Thank you, Paul. That was fascinating. We really wanted to hear your presentation on intergenerational mobility specifically because this ties in very much with the overall theme of our conclave, which we're talking about India's growth story from the 1991 reforms till today. So this is the 30-year sort of anniversary. And we obviously we care about intergenerational mobility, and that should be an outcome of the growth process and development process. So the results that you have are extremely interesting in this context. So I just had a couple of questions. So the first one is this: the theory of affirmative action leading to this. So can you do this similar kind of exercise that you did with the SCs for STs as well, who also have affirmative action?
Yeah, so there's a lot of new work being done trying to study different aspects of affirmative action. It's challenging in the long run. What's really neat about this natural experiment, which we borrowed from Guillaume Cassan, is that you have a policy change which immediately, arbitrarily changes the scheduled caste status of millions and millions of people, right? So that's a perfect context for examining a thing like this. I'm not aware of so it's harder to work on these questions for scheduled tribes because they're smaller in number. Actually, it's an interesting question on whether this policy change also changed definitions of groups with scheduled tribe status. So I haven't seen whether that has been done. I think it's a great question. I think new policies around OBCs are also interesting topics of study. There's good work by Saad Gulzar and others studying different aspects of these policies. So I think they're important to study. There's evidence that they have worked. I think there's a challenge whereby every group in India wants to have access to affirmative action. You have affirmative action for Brahmins in some states, and you can't. These policies are they're intensely political. I think there's evidence that they work, and I think seem particularly valuable for the poorest of classes. I think more broadly thinking about economic structure and access to opportunity, I don't think affirmative action is going to get you all the way there, right? I think at the fundamental level, we need a system where people can grow up and get a decent education, regardless of caste or class, and then be able to kind of compete on their own merits.
Yeah, so I was exactly going to talk about the OBCs after that. So you mentioned that it's already been worked on. So OBCs are reservations have seen a lot of people coming into the reserved categories and going out and things like this. So that would be an interesting sort of area to explore. The other thing why this is very interesting is because in India, of course, there's a huge debate about affirmative action, and if this is the channel that is working, it's going to be obviously a very important sort of argument in favor of this.
So I would just say,
another thing that
I think affirmative action is important, and particularly if you have these huge neighborhood level disparities in access to schooling, then you may need affirmative action to repair those disparities. At the same time, I think fundamentally one of the challenges that India faces is creating a greater sum total of opportunities. If you look at politics in India today, the discussion feels to me very motivated around this idea that there is a scarce number of slots in universities, in the government sector, and everyone is competing for that same number of slots. And I guess you can achieve fairness by reallocating those slots, but ultimately creating more slots and creating more opportunities is going to allow all groups to succeed rather than competing over the scarce number of slots. I would like to see kind of a policy dialogue in the direction not only of this idea that there are only so many university slots, who are we going to give them to, but how do we allow everyone to get access to a solid high school, and everyone at least have the opportunity to get a decent education that allows them to participate in the modern sector.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Of course, the politics regarding this is notorious, and we will have to sort of come out of it very soon. Um, Another thing that I wanted to ask you is that thanks for talking about the data, because that's also a very important and interesting part of this. I just wanted to ask you if it's possible with this data to look at other kinds of intergenerational mobility. So, can we look at occupations, for example, people moving out of the agricultural sector? Is that increasing? Is the chance of you going from agriculture to industry or whatever other occupation, is that changing over time? Is it possible to estimate things like this from this data?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. There's some work by Mehtapul Azam and co-authors studying occupational mobility in India in specifically. We see the average shift of the economy out of agriculture. So we know that on average, people are moving from the farm sector to the non-farm sector. This is a highly desirable change. I think it's a really interesting idea to study these transition matrices and think about who has options to get access to industrial jobs or white collar jobs. We haven't been able to do this with our data. One challenge is that in the coding of our administrative rural data, 90% of people living in villages are either agricultural laborers, cultivators, or wage workers. And it's not even clear, like you can't unambiguously say, oh, it's better to be a wage worker than an agricultural worker. I think there's huge overlap across all of these categories. So this is an area where I think there's really interesting work to be done on this in urban jobs and people kind of in the middle classes and looking at kind of access to white collar occupations. This is an area where some of the more detailed NSS data, which has kind of more detailed information about like what you do and how you spend your time, is maybe a little bit more valuable than the administrative data that we have. But I should say, what we have put into Shrug and what we've been able to access in terms of government data that is out there is like a drop in the bucket. So I think if you're a researcher working in India, you shouldn't be thinking, oh, what's in the Shrug for me to be able to do? You should be looking at what programs your local government is running and using your information and access to these programs. There's so much exciting administrative data that civil servants are often keen to find researchers who are ready to help them learn from the data they have. And what we think Shrug is doing is giving you a backbone that you can connect these new data sources to and do something interesting with it. If you have like a personnel data set, maybe you don't know what you can do with that by itself, but we're trying to make it really easy to connect it to the Shrug universe, kind of raise the value to people of building up these connections with civil servants and people who have access to government data to kind of mobilize the tremendously valuable information that's embedded in them.
All right. Yes, that will be extremely useful going forward. Looking forward to that. One last question I have for you is, for India, we can see this graph. There's not too much action there, right? So this it's quite flat. How does this compare to other countries, especially developing countries? Do other developing countries also suffer from this flat? So I don't know how many other studies have happened of this kind in other countries, but if you could just let us know about that.
Okay, I'll have to let you know about that in a few months because we're in the middle of a World Bank Finance project to conduct similar analysis across all of South Asia. And we're interested not in just average mobility levels, but in these group disparities to see whether kind of India is unique in having these like very large population groups who are systematically stuck in low mobility equilibria, or if that's different across countries. So that's something that we're actively working on, and but I don't know the answer yet.
All right, okay, that would be super interesting to look at. So I think with that we have just exhausted our time. So I'm going to have to finish off the session now. But Paul, thank you so much. Thank you for joining in. It was a very fascinating talk